For 34 years, Richland Ranch had been dead to him, just a piece of Texas dirt he'd inherited from a father who never wanted him. He'd driven 12 hours to sell it, sign the papers, and disappear back to his real life in Dallas. But someone was living in his house. A stranger had claimed what wasn't hers, sleeping in his father's bed, cooking in his mother's kitchen. And when the woman named Rose opened the door, she looked at him like he was the intruder. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The highway stretched flat and mean across West Texas, shimmering in heat that turned the asphalt into liquid mercury. Richard Hale kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the rental car's steering wheel, air conditioning blasting, eyes hidden behind sunglasses that cost more than most people in Richland made in a week. The landscape hadn't changed. Still the same endless scrubland, still the same barbed wire fences holding nothing in and nothing out, still the same sky so big it made you feel like an insect crawling across God's workbench. He'd sworn he'd never come back. That was 34 years ago, when he was 9 years old, and his mother packed 2 suitcases in the middle of the night, grabbed his hand, and walked away from Richland Ranch without looking back. His father hadn't chased them, hadn't called, hadn't written. The silence had been total, clean as a surgical cut. Now Victor Hale was dead, and Richard had inherited the one thing he'd spent his entire adult life forgetting existed. The lawyer's letter sat on the passenger seat, edges already curling in the heat despite the AC. Pursuant to the last will and testament of Victor James Hale, deceased, you are hereby notified of your inheritance of the property commonly known as Richland Ranch, comprising 847 acres. The rest was legal noise. The only part that mattered was the last line. Property taxes are 6 months in arrears. Immediate action recommended. Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Jennifer, his girlfriend of 8 months, texting from their condo in Dallas. How much longer? 2 hours. He typed back at a red light that shouldn't have existed out here in the middle of nowhere. This is ridiculous. Just hire someone to deal with it. He didn't respond. Jennifer didn't understand that some things you couldn't delegate. Some debts had to be paid in person, even if the payment was just showing up long enough to sign your name and walk away. The GPS took him off the highway onto Farm Road 1647, and suddenly he was 17 again, riding shotgun in Tommy Briggs's pickup, drinking stolen beer and pretending he didn't care that his father had missed another birthday. The road got narrower, the pavement giving way to caliche that pinged against the rental car's undercarriage. Richard winced. The deposit was going to be hell. Then he saw the gate. It still leaned to the left, exactly the way it had when he was 8 years old, and his father had promised to fix it next week. The iron arch over the cattle guard read Richland Ranch in letters that had once been painted white, but now were just rust and ghosts. Richard stopped the car, engine idling, and stared. He should feel something. Grief, maybe. Anger. Nostalgia. Something. Instead, there was just a hollow place in his chest where emotions were supposed to live. He got out, left the engine running, and swung the gate open. It screamed on hinges that hadn't seen oil in decades. The sound echoed across the empty land, and for just a second Richard thought he heard his father's voice. "Boy, you gonna stand there all day or you gonna be useful?" He got back in the car and drove through. The house appeared a quarter-mile later, rising out of the heat shimmer like a shipwreck. 2 stories of limestone and cedar, wraparound porch, tin roof that his great-grandfather had installed in 1923. Richard had loved that roof once, the way rain sounded on it like 1,000 tiny hammers, the way hail turned it into a drum that shook the whole house. Now it just looked tired. He parked in the circular drive where his mother used to keep roses. Before the drought killed them, before she gave up, before she decided that some things weren't worth saving. The house stood silent. Empty windows stared back at him like dead eyes. Richard killed the engine and sat there, hands still on the wheel, breathing the recycled air and wondering why he felt like he was about to walk into an ambush. Then he saw the smoke. It was just a thin ribbon rising from the chimney, almost invisible against the white sky. But it was there, definitely there. Richard's heart kicked against his ribs. Someone was inside. He got out slowly, quietly, like the car door closing might trigger something. The heat hit him like a wall, had to be pushing 104, maybe 105. His dress shoes crunched on gravel. The porch steps groaned under his weight, and Jesus, when had he gotten old enough to make stairs complain? The front door was closed, but not locked. The knob turned easily in his hand. Richard pushed it open. The smell hit him first, coffee and wood smoke and something cooking, maybe beans. Then the details filled in. Furniture that was different, but arranged the same way his mother had kept it. A quilt draped over the back of the couch that definitely hadn't been there before. Boots by the door. A woman's jacket hanging on the hook where his father used to keep his hat. And voices. A woman's voice, low and steady, coming from the kitchen. "I told you, Shadow, if you want supper, you're going to have to wait like everybody else." Richard stood frozen in the doorway of his father's house. His house now, legally his, listening to a stranger talk to a dog. "Hello?" His voice came out rough. He cleared his throat, tried again. "Hello?" The talking stopped. Footsteps, boot heels on hardwood, moving toward him. Then she was there, standing in the kitchen doorway, backlit by afternoon sun through the window, and Richard's brain stuttered trying to process what he was seeing. She was maybe 30, maybe older, the kind of woman whose age the sun had stolen. Dark hair pulled back in a braid, skin tanned the color of the land itself, wearing jeans and a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Her hands were scarred and calloused, her eyes were the color of creek water, and she was looking at him like he'd just tracked mud across a clean floor. "Can I help you?" she said. Richard's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Who the hell are you?" Her expression didn't change. "I asked first. I'm Richard Hale. This is my house." Something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, or recognition, but it was gone before he could name it. She crossed her arms. "Victor's boy." "Yeah, Victor's boy. Who are you and what are you doing in my house?" "Making dinner," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You want coffee?" "I want to know why you're living in my dead father's house." Now she looked at him differently, and Richard felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. She was measuring him, deciding something. "Name's Rose," she said finally. "Rose Delgado. And I'm not living in your house. I'm living in my home." Richard laughed, a short, bitter sound that surprised even him. "Your home? Lady, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but—" "Scam?" Now there was heat in her voice, the first real emotion he'd seen. "I've been keeping this place alive for 6 years while you were— Where, Dallas? Houston? Somewhere with air conditioning and people who don't know a damn thing about what it takes to make land like this survive? 6 years? Since Victor got sick, since he couldn't work anymore, since—" She stopped herself, jaw tight. "You want me to leave? Fine. But you better know how to fix a windmill, patch fence, and keep coyotes off the livestock, because this ranch doesn't run itself." "Livestock?" Richard's head was spinning. "There's no livestock. My father sold everything years ago." Rose made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Come on." She turned and walked toward the back of the house. Richard stood there for 3 full seconds before his legs decided to follow her. They went through the kitchen, which was cleaner than his mother had ever kept it, out the back door onto the porch that overlooked the barn and pastures. And there they were. Cattle. Maybe 30 head grazing in the far pasture, chickens scratching in a coop by the barn, a vegetable garden that looked like it belonged in a farming magazine. "How—" Richard's voice died in his throat. "Work," Rose said simply. "Same way anything survives out here. You work for it." A dog appeared from behind the barn, some kind of cattle dog mix, blue heeler maybe, with one ear up and one ear down. It trotted up to Rose and sat at her feet, watching Richard with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for tax collectors and snake oil salesmen. "That's Shadow," Rose said. "He was Victor's. Now he's mine." Richard felt something crack in his chest. The dog. He remembered the dog. Or not this dog exactly, but others like it. His father had always kept a ranch dog, always named it Shadow, always treated it better than he'd treated his own son. "I don't understand," Richard said, and hated how weak his voice sounded. "My father died 3 months ago. The lawyer said the house was empty. He said, 'Lawyers don't know everything.'" Rose knelt down, scratched Shadow behind the ears. "Victor made me promise not to contact you unless there was no other choice." "Why?" She looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes that might have been pity. You'd have to ask him that, but he's dead, so I guess you'll have to figure it out yourself. Richard wanted to yell, wanted to grab this woman by the shoulders and shake answers out of her, wanted to get in his rental car and drive back to Dallas and pretend none of this existed. Instead, he said, I came here to sell. I know. You can't stop me. I own this land. I know that too. Rose stood up, brushed dirt off her knees. But before you sign anything, you should probably look around, see what you're selling, what your father spent his whole life building. He didn't build anything, Richard snapped. He inherited this place from his father, just like I inherited it from him. It's just dirt, just empty, worthless dirt. Rose's jaw tightened. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, Victor told me you'd say something like that. Oh yeah? What else did dear old Dad tell you? That you'd be angry. That you'd want to hurt him even though he was already dead. That you probably had every right to feel that way. She paused. And that maybe, just maybe, if you stayed long enough, you'd understand why he did what he did. Richard laughed again, and this time it sounded mean even to his own ears. I don't want to understand. I want to sell this place, take the money, and forget it ever existed. Then do it, Rose said quietly. Sign the papers, take your money, leave. I will. Okay. They stood there on the back porch as the sun started its slow crawl toward the horizon, and Richard waited for her to beg or threaten or do something. But she just stood there, one hand on Shadow's head, looking out at the land like she was saying goodbye to something precious. Finally, Richard said, Where will you go? Rose shrugged. Don't know. Wherever people go when they lose their home, I guess. The words hit harder than they should have. Richard turned away, walked back into the house. He needed to think. Needed to call the lawyer, find out what his options were, figure out the fastest way to cut this woman loose and wash his hands of the whole situation. But when he stepped into the living room, he stopped. The photographs on the mantel were new, or at least new to him. His mother had kept the mantel empty, said it collected dust. But now it was covered in frames. Richard moved closer. The first photo showed his father, younger, maybe 50, standing next to a woman Richard didn't recognize. She was Hispanic, beautiful, laughing at something off camera. His father had his arm around her shoulders, and he was smiling. Actually smiling, the way Richard couldn't remember ever seeing him smile. The next photo showed the same woman holding a little girl, maybe 4 years old. Dark hair, serious eyes. The third photo made Richard's breath catch. It was recent, maybe a year old. His father, impossibly old, sitting on this very porch with Rose beside him, and Shadow at their feet. They looked like a family. Her name was Maria. Richard spun around. Rose stood in the doorway watching him. My mother, she continued. She worked at the feed store in town. Victor hired her to help with the books after your mother left. I was 6. Richard's hands curled into fists. I don't care about your life story. Too bad. You're going to hear it anyway. Rose walked past him, touched the photograph of her mother gently. Maria died when I was 14. Cancer. Victor took me in, raised me, taught me everything about this ranch. Why? Why do you think? Because he was a good man who didn't let kids end up alone. He let me end up alone, Richard said, and the words came out sharper than he'd intended. Rose turned to look at him. No, your mother took you away. There's a difference. He didn't fight for me, didn't even try. You know that for sure? Or is that just what you tell yourself? Richard felt heat rising up his neck into his face. Who the hell do you think you are? You don't know anything about my family. I know more than you do, Rose shot back. I was here. Where were you? I was 9 years old, and now you're 43. How many times did you come back? How many letters did you write? How many times did you pick up the phone? Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because she was right. He'd had 34 years to reach out, to ask questions, to try to understand. And he'd chosen silence, just like his father. Get out, he said quietly. Rose didn't move. This is my home. No, it's my property, legally, and I'm telling you to leave. She looked at him for a long moment, and Richard saw something in her face that made him feel small and cruel, and exactly like the man he'd sworn never to become. Then she nodded. Fine. I'll be gone by morning." She walked past him, shoulders straight, boots heavy on the hardwood. The back door opened and closed. Through the window, Richard watched her cross the yard toward the barn, Shadow trotting at her heels. He stood alone in his father's house. His house now, surrounded by photographs of people who'd built a life without him, and felt nothing but the hollow place where something important used to be. Night came fast and total in West Texas. One minute the sky was purple and orange, the next it was black as the bottom of a well. Richard sat on the front porch in the rocking chair his grandfather had built, drinking whiskey from a bottle he'd found in the kitchen cabinet, and listening to the wind move through the grass. The lights were on in the barn. He could see Rose's silhouette moving behind the cracks in the wood siding, packing, probably. Getting ready to leave in the morning like he'd told her to. Good. That's what he wanted, wasn't it? The whiskey burned going down. Richard hadn't eaten since breakfast, some gas station sandwich 6 hours ago, and the alcohol hit his bloodstream fast and mean. His phone buzzed. Jennifer again. "Call me. We need to talk." He ignored it. The door creaked and Richard jumped, heart hammering, but it was just the wind, the house settling, nothing. Except it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like the house was breathing. Richard stood up, too fast, the whiskey making the world tilt, and went inside. He'd sleep a few hours, wake up early, wait for Rose to leave, then call the lawyer and start the paperwork. Simple, clean. The stairs groaned under his weight. At the top landing, Richard paused, looking down the hallway. 4 doors, his old bedroom, his parents' room, the bathroom, and the spare room his mother had used for sewing. He opened the door to his old room and stopped dead. It was exactly the same. The bed in the corner, the bookshelf with his childhood books still on it, Where the Red Fern Grows, Old Yeller, Hatchet, the desk where he'd done homework, the window that looked out over the east pasture. His chest went tight. How had his father kept it like this for 34 years? Why? Richard backed out, closed the door. He couldn't deal with that room, not tonight, maybe not ever. Instead, he went to his parents' bedroom, except it wasn't his parents' bedroom anymore. The furniture was different, the quilt was different. It smelled different, like leather and wood smoke instead of his mother's perfume. This was his father's room, the room where Victor Hale had slept alone for 3 decades after his wife left him. Richard sat on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. The whiskey was making everything swim. Memories surfaced like bodies floating up from deep water. His father teaching him to ride. His father's hand on the back of his neck when he'd fallen off the barn roof. His father's voice saying, "You're tougher than you think, boy." And then the other memories. His father's silences. His father's back turned during dinner. His father's absence at every school play and baseball game and birthday party. The man had been 2 people, and Richard had only known one of them. He lay back on the bed, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come, too much whiskey, too many ghosts, so he just lay there as the hours crawled past, and the house creaked and settled around him like an old man's bones. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Richard heard it. Footsteps. Downstairs. He sat up, heart pounding. Rose was supposed to be in the barn, but those were definitely footsteps, moving through the living room into the kitchen. Richard grabbed his phone, turned on the flashlight, and crept out of the bedroom. The hallway was dark as pitch. He made his way to the stairs, careful not to make noise, and peered down into the living room. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. "Hello?" Richard's voice cracked. "Rose?" No answer. He went down the stairs, phone light cutting through the darkness. Living room? Empty. Kitchen? Empty. Back porch? Empty. Richard stood in the middle of the kitchen, breathing hard, telling himself it was just the house settling, just his imagination, just the whiskey and the stress and the lack of sleep. Then Shadow barked. One sharp bark from outside, then silence. Richard went to the back door, opened it. The barn lights were still on. Rose's silhouette was visible through the slats, and beside her, another figure, taller, broader, a man. Richard's blood went cold. Who the hell was in his barn at 3 in the morning? He should call the police, should stay inside where it was safe, should do literally anything except what he did next. He walked across the yard in his socks, gravel biting into his feet, and pushed open the barn door. Rose was there, sitting on a hay bale, shotgun across her knees. Shadow sat at her feet, Hackles raised. The barn was empty except for them. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded. Rose looked at him, and her face was pale. "I heard something." "I heard something too. Footsteps. In the house." "Not footsteps," Rose said quietly. "The windmill. The old one by the east pasture. It was turning." So there's no wind tonight." She stood up, shotgun still in her hands. "And that windmill's been broken for 15 years. They stood there in the dim barn light, and Richard felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "This place gets strange sometimes," Rose said. "Late at night. Victor used to say the land remembers things, holds on to them. That's ridiculous. Maybe." She shouldered the shotgun. "But I'm staying out here tonight anyway. You should probably lock your doors." Richard wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was being superstitious and stupid, but he'd heard those footsteps. He'd seen something. "What was my father like?" The question came out before Richard could stop it. "At the end, I mean. Did he... Rose's expression softened. "He was sick, confused sometimes. But he talked about you, every day almost. Wondered if you were happy, if you'd found what you were looking for." "He could have called." "Yeah," Rose agreed. He could have, but so could you." Richard's jaw clenched. "I'm going back to bed." "Lock your doors," Rose said again. Richard walked back to the house, and this time he did lock the back door and the front door. And he checked every window on the ground floor before he went back upstairs. He didn't sleep, just lay in his father's bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around him, and wondering what the hell he'd inherited besides dirt and ghosts, and a woman who looked at him like he was the stranger. When dawn finally came, gray and reluctant, Richard got up and looked out the window. Rose was in the east pasture, standing by the windmill, her hand on one of the blades. It was perfectly still. No wind, no movement. But Richard could have sworn, just for a second, that he saw it turn. Richard found Rose in the chicken coop at 7 in the morning, scattering feed from a dented metal bucket while the hens clucked and fought over every kernel. She didn't look up when he approached, didn't acknowledge him at all, just kept working like he was part of the scenery. "You're still here," he said. "Chickens need feeding." "I told you to leave." "And I will. Soon as I finish the morning chores." Rose straightened up, wiped her hands on her jeans. "Unless you want to do them yourself." Richard looked at the chickens, mean-eyed, pecking things that looked like they'd draw blood if he got too close. "I don't know how." "Then I guess you better learn." She held out the bucket. "They eat twice a day, morning and evening. You scatter it like this." She demonstrated with a handful of feed, throwing it in a wide arc. "Too much in one spot and they'll fight. Too little and they'll stop laying." "I'm selling this place. I don't need to know how to feed chickens." Rose set the bucket down at his feet. "Fine. Let them starve. But it'll take a week for the lawyer to process the paperwork. And in that week, these birds are your responsibility." She walked past him toward the barn, shadow trailing behind her. Richard stared at the bucket, then at the chickens, then picked up the damn thing and threw a handful of feed. The hens swarmed it like piranhas. "Not like that," Rose called from the barn door. "You'll teach them to fight." "I don't care if they kill each other." "Yeah, I'm getting that impression." She disappeared into the barn. Richard fed the chickens, badly, he was sure, then went back to the house. His phone had 3 missed calls from Jennifer and 1 from the lawyer. He called the lawyer first. "Mr. Hale," Preston Kimball said in the smooth voice of a man who'd never done manual labor in his life. "I trust you've arrived at the property." "Yeah, there's a problem." "Oh?" "There's a woman living here, says my father let her stay." A pause. "I wasn't aware of any tenancy agreement." "There isn't one. She just moved in after he got sick. Took care of him, apparently." Another pause, longer this time. "I see. Well, regardless of the circumstances, she has no legal claim to the property. You're well within your rights to ask her to vacate." "I did. She's leaving today." "Excellent. Then we can proceed with the sale. I've had 3 inquiries already. Developers interested in subdividing the acreage. The offers are quite generous." Richard looked out the kitchen window at the land rolling away to the horizon, the cattle grazing in the distance, the garden rows perfectly straight. "How generous?" "1.2 million for the full parcel. Or we could split it, sell the house and 10 acres to a private buyer, the rest to a development company. That would net you closer to 1.5. $1.5 million. More money than Richard had ever imagined having. Enough to pay off his condo, quit the job he hated, maybe even propose to Jennifer properly, instead of the half-assed, we should probably get serious conversation they'd had last month. Do it, Richard said. Whichever one closes fastest. I'll draw up the papers. You'll need to come to my office in Richland to sign, shall we say Thursday. That gives you a few days to clear out any personal effects you want to keep. Thursday's fine. Richard hung up and immediately felt lighter. 3 more days. That's all he had to survive here. 3 days and he'd never have to think about Richland Ranch again. He called Jennifer next. She answered on the first ring. Finally, she said, I've been calling all morning. Sorry, it's been complicated. How complicated can it be? Sign the papers and come home. There's a woman living here, squatting, basically. She says my father let her stay. So call the police. It's not that simple. Jennifer sighed, and Richard could picture her perfectly, standing in their kitchen in her yoga clothes, coffee in hand, already annoyed before 9 a.m. Richard, you're making this harder than it needs to be. That place means nothing to you. Just handle it and come home. I am handling it. The lawyer says we can close by Thursday. We? I mean me. I can close by Thursday. How much are we talking? Richard hesitated. Maybe 1.5 million. Silence. Then, Jesus, really? Yeah. Okay, that's actually amazing. Her voice warmed up considerably. We could buy a house. A real house, not a condo, maybe in Lakewood, or let's talk about it when I get back. When will that be? Thursday, Friday at the latest. I miss you, Jennifer said, and Richard knew he was supposed to say it back, but the words stuck in his throat. Yeah, he said instead. I'll call you later. He hung up and stood in the kitchen that smelled like coffee he hadn't made, in the house that felt more alive now than it ever had when he'd lived here as a kid, and wondered why he felt like he'd just lied to someone. Outside, Rose was working on the fence line that ran along the north pasture. Richard could see her from the porch, hammering in a post, shadow lying in the shade watching her work. She moved with the kind of efficiency that came from doing the same task 1,000 times, no wasted motion, no hesitation. Richard's legs carried him across the yard before his brain caught up. What are you doing? Rose didn't look up from the post she was setting. Fixing the fence. Coyotes got through last night, scattered the cattle. That's not your job anymore. It is until the sun goes down. She straightened, wiped sweat from her forehead. I don't leave things half-finished. Why are you doing this? Doing what? All of it. The chickens, the fence, everything. I told you to leave. You don't owe me anything. Rose looked at him then, and her eyes were hard. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for the ranch, for the animals, for... She trailed off, shook her head. Doesn't matter. You wouldn't understand. Try me. She laughed, bitter, sharp. You really want to know? Fine. This place is dying, Richard. Has been dying for years. Your father held it together with spit and stubbornness, but he was one man and he was old and sick. The fences are rotting. The windmills need parts we can't afford. The cattle are underfed because we don't have enough grazing land cleared. And now you're going to sell it to some developer who'll bulldoze the whole thing and build tract houses with names like Ranch View Estates. So this land has been in your family for 4 generations. Your great-grandfather built this house with his own hands. Your grandfather survived the Dust Bowl here. My father abandoned me, Richard cut in. He chose this place over his own son. So yeah, I'm going to sell it, and I'm going to take the money and forget it ever existed. Rose studied him for a long moment. Then she picked up her hammer. If that's what you need to do, it is. Okay. She went back to work. And Richard stood there feeling dismissed and angry, and somehow in the wrong even though he wasn't. This was his land, his decision, his right. He walked back to his house and spent the next hour going through his father's things, looking for anything worth keeping. The bedroom dresser held clothes, all worn, all mended, all smelling faintly of the cedar chips his father had always kept to ward off moths. The closet had boots, a good hat, and a rifle Richard vaguely remembered. In the bedside table he found a Bible, untouched, spine uncracked, and underneath it, a wooden box. Richard pulled it out, sat on the bed, and opened it. Letters. Dozens of them, bundled with twine. Richard pulled out the first bundle and his heart stopped. They were addressed to him. Every single one. His name written in his father's blocky handwriting. Richard Hale, 2847 Meadowbrook Lane, Austin, Texas. But none of them had been mailed. No stamps, no postmarks. Just letters his father had written and never sent. Richard's hands shook as he opened the first one. Dear Richard, you turned 10 today. Your mother sent a picture. You look happy. That's good. I'm glad she took you somewhere you could be happy. The ranch had its first frost last night, earlier than usual. I thought about teaching you to check the cattle in cold weather, make sure they have shelter, but I guess that doesn't matter now. I hope you're doing well in school. I hope you're making friends. I hope you don't hate me too much. Your father, Richard, read it 3 times. Then he opened another. Dear Richard, you're 12 now, almost a man. I wonder what you look like, if you're tall yet. If you still have that stubborn way of setting your jaw when you're mad. A girl started coming around the ranch, Maria's daughter, Rose. She reminds me of you sometimes, the way she asks questions about everything. The way she doesn't quit when something's hard. I know I should have called, should have written, should have done a lot of things, but I didn't know what to say. Still don't. Your father. There were dozens more, one for every birthday, every Christmas, every major event. Richard's high school graduation, his college acceptance, moments his father had somehow known about, had kept track of from a distance. The last letter was dated 6 months before Victor died. Dear Richard, I'm sick. Don't know how much time I have left. Rose keeps telling me to call you, to make things right before it's too late. But I look at the phone and I can't make my fingers dial. I was never good with words. Your mother knew that. You probably remember that. I showed love by working, by providing, by keeping the ranch alive so you'd have something solid to inherit. But I guess that wasn't enough. I failed you. Failed your mother. Failed everyone except maybe this land. Rose will take care of the place after I'm gone. She's stronger than me. Better than me. She deserves it more than anyone. But I'm leaving it to you anyway. Because you're my son. And maybe, probably not, but maybe, you'll come back and see what I tried to build. What I wanted to give you. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you needed. I'm sorry for everything, your father. Richard sat on the bed holding letters his father had written over 34 years, and something cracked open in his chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but understanding. His father had been just as trapped by silence as Richard was, just as bad at saying the things that mattered. The door creaked. Richard looked up to find Rose standing in the doorway, dirty from fence work, shadow at her heels. Found the letters, she said. It wasn't a question. You knew about these? He wrote one every year on your birthday, sometimes more. I told him to mail them. Why didn't he? Rose leaned against the door frame. Same reason you didn't call for 34 years. Pride, fear. The longer you wait, the harder it gets to break the silence. Richard carefully put the letters back in the box. He wrote about you, said you deserved this place. He was wrong. Was he? Richard looked at her. You've been here 6 years, taking care of him, taking care of the ranch. Why? Rose was quiet for a long time. Then, you want the truth? Yeah, because I didn't have anywhere else to go. Because when my mother died, Victor was the only person who gave a damn if I lived or died. Because this ranch was the first place that ever felt like home. She paused. And because he asked me to. At the end, when he was dying, he asked me to keep it alive until you came back. I wasn't coming back. He hoped anyway. Richard felt anger rising again, but this time it was tangled up with guilt and grief and a dozen other emotions he didn't want to name. I'm still selling. I know. You can't stop me. I'm not trying to. Then why are you still here? Why are you fixing fences and feeding chickens and acting like you have any claim to this place? Rose's expression hardened. Because it's what I do. It's who I am. You take that away and I'm just nothing. The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Richard stood up. The lawyer says Thursday. That's when we close. Okay. You need to be gone by then. I will be. She turned to leave, but Richard heard himself say, "Where will you go?" Rose stopped but didn't turn around. "Don't know yet. Maybe Lubbock, maybe Midland. Somewhere they need ranch hands." "You're not just a ranch hand. Out here I am." She looked back at him. "You think any of those fancy developers want a woman who knows how to birth a calf and fix a windmill? They want surveyors and construction crews and architects. People like me don't exist in their world." She left before Richard could respond. He spent the rest of the day going through the house, boxing up things to donate, throwing away things that didn't matter. He worked mechanically, trying not to think about the letters or Rose or the fact that in 3 days this would all be someone else's problem. Around 4 in the afternoon, Shadow started barking. Richard looked out the window to see a truck pulling up the drive, beat up Ford, at least 20 years old, with a magnetic sign on the door that read, "Hollis Feed and Supply." An old man climbed out, weathered as the land itself, wearing overalls and a hat that had seen better decades. He spotted Rose in the garden and headed straight for her. Richard went outside, arriving just as the old man was saying, "Can't believe he's actually doing it." "Doing what?" Richard asked. The old man turned, looked Richard up and down with eyes that had seen too much sun. "You must be Victor's boy." "Richard." "Tom Hollis. Knew your father 40 years. He didn't offer his hand. Heard you're selling." Word travels fast. Small town, and people talk when something like Richland Ranch is about to disappear. Tom shook his head. "Your father would be rolling in his grave." "My father's dead. He doesn't get a vote." "Maybe not. But the rest of us live here. We depend on this land staying ranch land, not turning into some cookie-cutter suburb." "That's not my problem." Tom's jaw tightened. "You know how many ranches this county's lost in the last 10 years? 17. 17 families that gave up or sold out or got foreclosed on. This land is dying, boy, and people like you are killing it." "People like me?" "City folk who inherit something they don't understand and can't wait to turn it into cash." Richard felt his temper spike. "I don't owe this place anything. I don't owe you anything." "No," Tom agreed. "But you owe her." He nodded at Rose. "She's the only reason this ranch is still breathing. She worked herself half to death keeping it alive while Victor was sick, spent her own money on feed and medicine and fence wire, and now you're going to sell it out from under her like she's nothing." "That's enough," Rose said quietly. "The hell it is. You deserve better than this." "Tom, please." The old man glared at Richard one more time, then climbed back in his truck. "You want to sell? Fine. But don't expect anyone in this town to forget what you did." He drove off in a cloud of dust, leaving Richard and Rose standing in awkward silence. "Sorry about that," Rose said finally. "Tom's protective." "So I noticed." "He's not wrong, though. About the ranches, I mean. We're losing them fast. Another 10 years and this whole county will be suburbs and strip malls." "Progress." "Is it?" Rose looked at him. "You know what happens when you pave over ranch land? You lose the aquifer recharge, you lose the wildlife corridors, you lose the people who know how to work with the land instead of against it. You lose everything that makes this place worth living in." "I thought you were leaving." "I am. Doesn't mean I don't care what happens after." Richard wanted to argue, to tell her she was being dramatic, but he couldn't find the words. Because part of him, the part that remembered riding horses at dawn and fishing in the creek and feeling like the sky was so big you could disappear into it, understood what she meant. That night Rose cooked dinner. Richard didn't ask her to, didn't expect her to, but at 6 o'clock she came to the back door and said, "Food's ready if you want it." They ate at the kitchen table, chicken and beans and cornbread. Not talking, just the sound of forks on plates and the wind outside. Shadow lay under the table, head on Rose's boot. Finally Richard said, "This is good. It's just beans." "Still good." Rose nodded but didn't look up. "Why didn't you fight me?" Richard asked. "When I told you to leave? You could have argued, could have claimed squatters' rights or something." "But—" "Because it wouldn't change anything. This is your land. You get to decide what happens to it." "But you don't agree with my decision." "No." "Why not?" Rose set down her fork. "Because some things are worth more than money. Because this ranch has history and blood and sweat soaked into every acre. Because your father spent his whole life trying to keep it alive. And you're throwing that away without even trying to understand why it mattered to him. It didn't matter to him more than I did. Are you sure about that? Richard's hands clenched. He let us leave. He never called, never visited, never what? Never respected your mother's decision? Never chased after a woman who made it clear she didn't want this life? Rose leaned forward. You think your father didn't love you? Read those letters again. Every word is about you, your happiness, your life. He just didn't know how to be part of it. He could have tried. So could you. The words hit like a slap. Richard stood up, chair scraping loud against the floor. I'm going for a walk. He left before Rose could respond, went out into the cooling evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky impossible colors, orange and pink and purple bleeding together. Richard walked without direction, just moving, trying to burn off the anger and guilt churning in his stomach. He ended up at the old windmill, the one Rose said had been broken for 15 years. It stood silent against the darkening sky, blades motionless, but the ground around it was covered in fresh boot prints. Rose's boot prints. Richard looked closer and saw that someone, Rose, obviously, had been working on it. New bolts on the base, fresh oil on the gears. The blades themselves looked like they'd been straightened, repaired. She'd been trying to fix it. Even knowing she'd be gone in 3 days, even knowing Richard was selling, she'd spent her time trying to repair a broken windmill that would probably be torn down next month. Richard sat down on the ground, back against the windmill post, and let his head fall into his hands. What the hell was he doing? He sat there until full dark, until the stars came out thick and bright the way they never did in Dallas, until the temperature dropped and he started to shiver. Then he walked back to the house. The lights were off except for Rose's room upstairs, the sewing room that had become hers at some point. Richard stood in the yard looking up at that lit window and thought about knocking on her door, about saying something, anything, that might make sense of the mess in his head. Instead, he went to bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Richard lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about his father's letters, about Rose's hands scarred from fence wire, about Tom Hollis's angry eyes, about Jennifer waiting in Dallas for him to come home with a check for $1.5 million, about the fact that he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt like he belonged anywhere. Around midnight, he heard it again, footsteps downstairs. But this time, Richard didn't get up to investigate. He just lay there listening to the house breathe, to the sounds of something moving through rooms he'd grown up in, and wondered if it was ghosts or memories or just the wind playing tricks. At dawn, he found Rose already awake, sitting on the back porch with coffee, watching the sun come up over the east pasture. Couldn't sleep either? She said without looking at him. Richard sat down on the porch steps. The house is loud at night. Yeah, Victor used to say the same thing, said it got louder the older he got, like the ranch was talking to him. What was it saying? Rose smiled, sad, distant, probably telling him he was an idiot for not calling you. They sat in silence as the sky went from black to gray to gold. Shadow wandered over, sniffed Richard's hand, then decided he wasn't interesting and went to lie down at Rose's feet. I fixed the windmill, Rose said suddenly. The broken one. Took me 3 months, but I got it working again last week. I saw. It'll be good for the next buyer, more water access for the cattle. Richard didn't say anything. Thursday, Rose said. That's 2 days from now. Yeah. You sure about this? Richard opened his mouth to say yes, to confirm that he was sure, that nothing had changed, that he was still selling and leaving and never coming back. But the word stuck in his throat like a bone. Because somewhere between the letters and the chickens and the windmill and Rose's hands rebuilding things she'd never own, something had shifted. Not enough to change his mind, not yet, but enough to make him wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to this place than dirt and bad memories. Ask me on Thursday, Richard said finally. Rose looked at him for the first time that morning, and in her eyes he saw something that might have been hope, or might have been pity. Richard spent Tuesday morning learning things he'd forgotten he ever knew. Rose showed him how to check the cattle for pink eye, how to tell if a fence post was rotting just by looking at it, how to read the sky for weather that wouldn't show up on any app. She didn't explain why she was teaching him. They both knew he was leaving in 2 days. But she did it anyway, her voice patient and matter-of-fact, like she was passing down information that would die with her if she didn't. See that cloud formation? She pointed west where the sky was darkening. That's rain. Real rain. Not just Virga. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. You'll want to move the cattle to higher ground before it hits. I won't be here tomorrow. Rose glanced at him. Then I guess they'll have to move themselves. They were standing by the south fence line, Shadow panting in the shade of the truck. The heat was vicious, had to be pushing 108, and Richard's shirt was soaked through. He'd forgotten how the sun out here didn't just warm you, it stripped you down to nothing, burned away anything soft. Your father used to say the ranch teaches you what you need to know, Rose said, hammering a staple into a fence post. You just have to pay attention. Yeah? What did it teach you? She paused, hammer in mid-swing. That home isn't where you're born. It's where you decide to stay. Richard didn't have an answer for that. They worked until noon, then drove back to the house in Rose's truck, a 1987 Chevy that ran on hope and stubbornness. The radio didn't work. The AC was a joke, but the engine turned over every time. Rose drove with one hand, the other resting on Shadow's head in the space between them. You ever think about leaving? Richard asked. Before all this. Before my father died. Every day for the first year. What changed? Rose was quiet for a long moment. I stopped thinking of it as Victor's ranch and started thinking of it as mine. Not legally, I knew that. But in my head, in my heart, I decided this was the place I was going to fight for, no matter what. And now you're losing it anyway. Yeah, funny how that works. Back at the house, Richard's phone was ringing. Jennifer. He'd been avoiding her calls since yesterday, knowing what she wanted to talk about, not ready to have that conversation. He answered anyway. Finally, Jennifer said, I've been calling all morning. Sorry, I was working. Working? Doing what? Ranch stuff, fences. Jennifer laughed like he'd made a joke. You're fixing fences? Richard, just hire someone. That's not your job. There's no one to hire. It's just me and... He stopped. And the squatter? Her name is Rose. I don't care what her name is. She needs to go so you can close on Thursday and come home. A pause. You're still closing on Thursday, right? Richard looked out the window at Rose unloading feed bags from the truck, Shadow supervising. Yeah, Thursday. Good. Because I've been looking at houses online and there's this amazing property in Lakewood, 4 bedrooms, completely renovated, and the market's hot, so we need to move fast. We haven't even talked about buying a house together. We're talking about it now. With $1.5 million, we can afford something really nice. Something we could actually raise kids in. Richard's chest went tight. Kids? Eventually. I mean, we're not getting any younger, right? Jennifer's voice had that planning tone she got when she'd already made up her mind about something. I'm thinking we could be moved in by fall, married by spring, start trying by next year. Jen, slow down. Why? We've been together almost a year. We're both in our 40s. If we're going to do this, we need to actually do it. I know, Richard ran a hand through his hair. Can we talk about this when I get back? Silence. Then, are you having second thoughts? About us? No, about the house, about everything. What's everything? I don't know yet. More silence, colder this time. You're not thinking about keeping that ranch, are you? I'm thinking about it. Jennifer's laugh was sharp. Richard, that's insane. You hate that place. You've spent your entire adult life avoiding it. I know. So what changed in 3 days? Richard watched Rose hoist a 50-pound feed bag onto her shoulder like it weighed nothing, carry it into the barn. I found letters. From my father. He wrote me every year on my birthday, but never sent them. Okay, so he felt guilty. That doesn't mean you owe him anything. I'm not saying I do. I'm just saying maybe I need to understand why he stayed, why this place mattered to him. It mattered more than you did. Isn't that reason enough to sell? The words hit harder than they should have. I'll call you later. Richard? He hung up. Rose came out of the barn, saw him standing there with the phone in his hand. Trouble in paradise? Something like that. The girlfriend doesn't understand why you're not back yet. How'd you know about her? You talk in your sleep, kept hearing you mumble Jennifer and sorry and I'll be home soon. Rose grabbed a water bottle from the cooler, drank half of it. She want you to sell? She wants a house in Lakewood, 4 bedrooms, room for kids. That what you want? Richard looked at her. I don't know what I want. Yeah, you do. You're just scared to admit it. And what do you think I want? Rose capped the water bottle. I think you want permission to walk away. Want someone to tell you it's okay to sell this place, take the money, and never look back. But I also think part of you, the part that spent all morning learning how to fix fence, wants to stay. That's ridiculous. Is it? Because you're still here. Closing's tomorrow, and you're still here, learning things you won't need to know if you sell. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but Rose was already walking back to the barn, done with the conversation, done with him. He spent the afternoon in his father's office, a small room off the kitchen that Victor had used for ranch bookkeeping. The desk was old oak, scarred and stained, covered in ledgers and receipts and notes written in his father's blocky handwriting. Richard started sorting through it all, looking for anything important, anything the lawyer might need. That's when he found the drawer. It was locked, which was strange because nothing else in the house was locked. Richard jimmied it open with a letter opener, and inside found a manila folder, water-stained and brittle. He opened it. More photographs. The first showed a younger Victor, maybe 40, standing next to a woman Richard didn't recognize at first. Then he saw the eyes, the smile, and realized it was Rose's mother, Maria. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or fashion, beautiful in the way of women who worked hard and laughed easily. The next photo showed Maria and Victor at some kind of town event, dancing. His father looked happy, actually happy, in a way Richard had never seen. Then came a photo that made Richard's breath catch. Victor, Maria, and a little girl, maybe 6 years old, sitting on the front porch of this house. The girl had dark hair and pigtails and was holding Victor's hand, grinning at the camera. Rose. Had to be Rose. And they looked like a family. But there was something else in the photo. In the background, barely visible through the window, was another child. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, watching them from inside the house. Richard stared at that shadowy figure and felt something cold slide down his spine. That was him. He'd been here, had seen his father with Maria and Rose, had watched them be a family while he stood alone inside the house like a ghost. Richard's hands shook as he pulled out the next photograph. This one was more recent, maybe 10 years ago. Victor and Rose working together on a fence, both of them laughing at something. Behind them, written in his father's handwriting, the daughter who stayed. The daughter who stayed. Not the daughter he raised, not the daughter he kept, the daughter who stayed. Which made Richard the son who left. He heard footsteps and looked up to find Rose in the doorway, frozen, staring at the photographs spread across the desk. Where did you find those? Her voice was barely a whisper. Locked drawer, I didn't know. Richard stopped. You were here. When I was a kid, you lived here. Rose didn't move. For a while. How long? 6 years, from when I was 6 until I was 12, until my mother died. Richard stood up, photographs clenched in his fist. I remember you. I remember a little girl here sometimes, but I thought you were just the help's kid or something. I didn't know you lived here. I didn't live here. My mom and I had a place in town, but I spent most days here after school. Victor taught me to ride, taught me ranch work. He was... Rose's voice cracked. He was like a father to me, more than my real father ever was. While I was here, while I was living in this house, he was being a father to you. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Richard's voice rose. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he replaced me, found himself a better kid, one who actually wanted to be here. Rose's eyes flashed. You think it was easy, being the Mexican girl at the White Rancher's house? Having people in town whisper about why Victor Hale spent so much time with Maria Delgado and her daughter? You think I didn't know what they said? What did they say? That my mother was his mistress, that I was probably his bastard kid, that we were gold diggers trying to get our hands on Richland Ranch. Rose's voice was shaking now. But none of it was true. My mother loved Victor, and he loved her, but they couldn't. Why not? Because your mother. Victor never divorced her, even after she left. Even after years of silence, he stayed married to her until the day she died. Said vows meant something, so he and my mother just existed in this space between together and apart. Richard sank back into the chair. When did my mother die? 8 years ago. Cancer. Nobody told me. Victor tried to call you. Got your voicemail, left a message. You never called back. Richard remembered that message. He'd deleted it without listening, assumed it was his father calling drunk or lonely or looking for money he didn't have. He'd never imagined it was about his mother. And after she died, Richard asked, after my mother was gone, why didn't Victor marry Maria then? Rose looked away. Because Maria was already dead. She died 2 years before your mother. The timeline crashed into Richard like a wave. His mother had died 8 years ago. Maria had died 10 years ago, which meant Victor had spent the last 8 years of his life alone, bound by vows to a dead woman, having lost the woman he actually loved. That's why you're here, Richard said slowly. That's why he asked you to stay. You were all he had left of her. Rose nodded, not trusting her voice. Did he love you? The question came out harsher than Richard intended. Did he love you the way he should have loved me? He loved you, Rose said quietly. Every letter he wrote, every birthday he remembered, every time he stared at that phone wanting to call, he loved you, Richard. He just didn't know how to show it. And you? He knew how to show it to you. Because I was here. Because I chose to be here. Love isn't something you deserve, it's something you accept. And you left before you could accept his. I was 9 years old. And then you were 19, and 29, and 39. How old did you have to be before you picked up the phone? The words hung between them like a blade. Richard wanted to scream at her, wanted to throw the photographs across the room, wanted to punch something until his knuckles bled. Instead, he just sat there, breathing hard, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under him. I found something else, Rose said after a long moment. She walked to the desk, pulled open the bottom drawer, the one Richard hadn't gotten to yet, and took out a legal document. Richard took it, scanned the first page. It was a will, not the official one the lawyer had. This one was handwritten, dated 2 weeks before Victor died. I, Victor James Hale, being of sound mind. Richard skipped down to the important part. I leave Richland Ranch in equal shares to my son, Richard Hale, and my daughter, Rose Delgado. His daughter, not his ward, not his employee, his daughter. Richard looked up at Rose. He claimed you. No, he wrote it, but he never filed it. This isn't legal. Why not? Why write it if he wasn't going to make it official? Rose's eyes were wet now. Because he was scared. Scared you'd contest it. Scared it would look like he was trying to write you out of your inheritance. Scared of what people would think if he officially called me his daughter when he already had a son. So he left you nothing. He left me everything that mattered. This house, this land, 6 years of memories. But legally? Rose shook her head. Legally, I'm nobody. Just the girl who took care of him when he got sick. Richard stared at the will, at his father's shaky handwriting, at the word daughter next to Rose's name. You could fight this. Take this to a lawyer, claim you were owed something. I could, but I won't. Why not? Because Victor made his choice, and I'm not going to dishonor his memory by fighting you for something he clearly wanted you to have. He wanted us both to have it, but he only gave it to you. There's a difference. Richard set the will down carefully, like it might explode. I don't understand him. I don't understand any of this. Neither do I, Rose admitted. I spent 6 years watching him get sicker, watching him stare at the phone, watching him write letters he'd never send. I begged him to call you, begged him to make things right before it was too late. But he was stubborn and proud and scared, and in the end, the fear won. Fear of what? Of you hating him. Of you confirming what he already believed, that he was a bad father who'd failed his only son. It's easier to live with possibility than certainty. Richard thought about his own phone calls he hadn't made, his own messages he'd deleted, his own years of silence. I hated him, he said quietly. For a long time, I really hated him. I know. But I also loved him, and I don't know which one is true. Rose sat down on the edge of the desk. Maybe they both are. Maybe that's what family is. Loving and hating someone at the same time, and choosing which one to feed. They sat in silence as the afternoon sun slanted through the window, painting everything gold. Shadow wandered in, sniffed the photographs, then curled up at Rose's feet like he'd been doing it his whole life. I'm still selling, Richard said, but the words came out uncertain. Rose nodded. I know. The appointment's tomorrow at 2. I know. You should come with me. To the lawyer's office. Maybe there's something we can do. Some way to split the proceeds or, I don't want the money, Richard. I never wanted the money. Then what do you want? Rose looked at him with those creek water eyes. I want you to understand what you're giving up. I want you to see this place the way Victor saw it, the way I see it. Not as dirt or dollars, but as something worth fighting for, worth suffering for, worth staying for. It's just land. No, it's legacy. It's history. It's every person who ever worked this soil and bled for it and loved it despite how hard it fought back. Your great-grandfather carved this ranch out of nothing. Your grandfather kept it alive through the Dust Bowl when everybody else was giving up. Your father spent 50 years maintaining what they built. And now you're going to erase all of that because you're angry at a dead man. I have a right to be angry. You do, but anger doesn't keep the lights on, doesn't feed the cattle, doesn't mean a damn thing to the land. Richard stood up. I need air. He walked out before Rose could respond, out the back door into the brutal heat. The sky to the west was dark now. Those rain clouds Rose had predicted rolling in fast. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of wet earth even though it hadn't started raining yet. Richard walked without direction, feet carrying him past the barn, past the chicken coop, out to the old windmill. It was turning now, blades creaking in the wind, pumping water into the stock tank below. Rose had fixed it, had spent months repairing something that would probably be torn down next month. He sat down with his back against the windmill post and watched the storm come. The first drops fell fat and heavy, kicking up dust. Then the sky opened up, and rain came down in sheets, soaking Richard in seconds. He didn't move, just sat there letting the water pour over him, washing away the sweat and dust and everything else. When the rain finally eased to a drizzle, Rose appeared with 2 beers. She was soaked too, hair plastered to her face, but she sat down next to him like this was perfectly normal. Figured you could use this, she said, handing him a bottle. They drank in silence, watching the rain, watching the land drink it up like it had been dying of thirst. My father used to bring me out here during storms, Richard said, when I was really young, before everything went bad. We'd sit right here and he'd tell me about how this windmill saved the ranch during a drought in '52, how his father worked 3 days straight to get it running again. He told me the same story. Richard looked at her. He talked to you, really talked, didn't he? Yeah, especially at the end when he knew he was dying. He told me everything, about your mother, about you, about every mistake he ever made. What did he say about me? Rose took a long drink. That you were the thing he was proudest of and the thing he regretted most. Proud because you got out, made something of yourself, didn't let this place trap you the way it trapped him. Regret because he'd lost you in the process. He didn't lose me. He pushed me away. Did he? Or did your mother pull you away and he just didn't fight hard enough to keep you? Richard didn't have an answer for that. They finished their beers as the rain stopped and the sun broke through the clouds, turning everything golden and new. The land looked different after rain, greener, softer, possible. I found the deed, Rose said suddenly, the original one, from when your great-grandfather bought this land in 1891. It's in the safe in the bedroom. I didn't know there was a safe. Behind the painting of the Longhorns, combination's your birthday. Richard's throat went tight. My birthday? Victor changed it after you left, said it was the only way he could remember it, having to type it in every time he needed something from the safe. They walked back to the house, wet and tired and not talking. Richard went upstairs, moved the painting, and there it was, an old safe, combination lock worn smooth. He dialed his birthday, June 14th, '83. It opened. Inside were more papers. The original deed, like Rose said. Birth certificates, death certificates. Marriage license for Victor and Richard's mother, dated 1981. And at the bottom, a photograph Richard had never seen. His parents on their wedding day. Young, happy, so full of hope it hurt to look at. His mother was beautiful. Richard had forgotten how beautiful. His father looked terrified and proud and completely in love. What had happened to them? What had turned this young couple into 2 people who couldn't stand to be in the same room? Richard knew the answer. The ranch had happened, the isolation, the money struggles, the slow wearing down of 2 people who wanted different things. His mother had wanted city lights and culture, and a life bigger than 800 acres of Texas hardpan. His father had wanted roots and legacy and to maintain what his father had built. Neither of them was wrong, but they couldn't both be right. Rose appeared in the doorway. "Find what you needed?" Richard held up the wedding photo. "They loved each other once. Most people do, at the beginning. What happened to your mother? How did she die?" Rose leaned against the doorframe. "Cancer. Ovarian. By the time they caught it, it was everywhere. She lasted 6 months. Victor paid for everything. The hospital, the treatments, the funeral. My real father hadn't been around since I was 2, so Victor just stepped in. Became what she needed him to be. And after she died, you stayed. Where else was I going to go? I was 14. Victor was the only family I had left. So he raised you. He tried, but I was angry and grieving, and I made it hard. Ran away twice. Got in trouble at school. Pushed every boundary just to see if he'd give up on me, too." Rose smiled sadly. But he didn't. He just kept showing up, kept setting boundaries, kept being there even when I was awful to him. Sounds familiar. Yeah, I think that's why he understood you. Why he never fought your mother for custody. Because he knew what it was like to want to run, to want to be anywhere but here, and he couldn't hate you for choosing that. Richard carefully put the photograph back in the safe, closed the door. "Tomorrow's Wednesday." "I know. Appointment's at 2. "You said that already." Richard turned to look at her. "Come with me, to the lawyer's office. Even if you won't take any money, even if you won't fight the will, just come with me." "Why?" "Because this shouldn't just be my decision. Because you've earned a voice in what happens to this place. Because it's the right thing to do." Rose studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." That night, Richard couldn't sleep again. He lay in his father's bed listening to the house creak and settle, thinking about wedding photos and unsent letters and all the ways people failed each other despite their best intentions. Around midnight, he got up and went downstairs. The living room was dark except for moonlight through the windows. Richard stood looking at the photographs on the mantel, his father's other family, the life he'd built after Richard left. Then he saw it. Behind the photo of Victor and Maria, partially hidden, was another frame. Richard pulled it out and his breath caught. It was him. 9 years old, sitting on a horse, grinning at the camera. His father must have taken the picture. Richard could remember that day, remembered how proud he'd been that he'd finally learned to ride without help. His father had kept it, all these years hidden behind other photos, but kept, preserved. Richard stood there holding his 9-year-old self and felt something break open in his chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something close. Understanding, maybe. Or just the beginning of it. He heard footsteps and turned to find Rose on the stairs wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, shadow at her heels. "Can't sleep?" she asked. Thinking too much. She came down, looked at the photo in his hands. "Victor showed me that once, said it was his favorite picture of you, said you looked happy." "I was happy. For a while." They stood together in the dark living room, and Richard thought about all the different versions of his father. The one who'd taught him to ride, the one who'd let him leave, the one who'd raised Rose, the one who'd written letters he never sent, the one who'd kept this photograph for 34 years. Maybe they were all true. Maybe people were too complicated to be just one thing. "I don't know what to do," Richard said quietly. Rose didn't answer right away, then, "Tomorrow you'll know. One way or another, tomorrow you'll know." But as Richard went back to bed, as he lay in the dark listening to the ranch breathe around him, he realized Rose was wrong. He already knew. He'd known since he found the letters, since he'd sat in the rain by the windmill, since he'd held that photograph of his 9-year-old self looking happy on a horse. The question wasn't what to do. The question was whether he had the courage to do it. Wednesday morning broke hot and clear, the kind of day that made you remember why people called this part of Texas unforgiving. Richard woke at dawn to find Rose already gone, her truck missing from the drive. He made coffee in the kitchen that still smelled like her, wood smoke and leather and something else he couldn't name, and tried to organize his thoughts before the lawyer's appointment. His phone had 17 missed calls, 12 from Jennifer, 3 from his boss, 2 from numbers he didn't recognize. He ignored them all. At 8:30, Rose's truck rattled back up the drive. She got out carrying a cardboard box, Shadow jumping down after her. Richard met her at the door. "Where'd you go?" "Town. Had to pick something up." She set the box on the kitchen table. "Coffee ready?" "Yeah." They drank in silence until Richard couldn't stand it anymore. "What's in the box?" Rose opened it. Inside were dozens of photographs, some in frames, some loose. She spread them across the table like cards. Town history. Asked Mrs. Chen at the library if I could borrow the ranch archives. She said yes. Richard picked up the nearest photo. It showed his great-grandfather standing in front of a half-built house. This house. In 1891. The man looked hard as the land itself, all bones and determination. "That's James Hale," Rose said. "Bought this land for $300. People told him he was crazy, that nothing would grow here, that the drought would kill him. He proved them wrong." She laid out another photo. "This is 1935, Dust Bowl. Your grandfather Samuel kept the ranch alive when 13 other properties in the county went under. See that?" She pointed to the background where men were building something. "Windmills. He built 7 of them in 2 years, hand-dug the wells himself." More photos. The ranch through the decades, the house expanding, the barns being built, cattle in the pastures, people Richard didn't recognize working land he was about to sell. "Why are you showing me this?" Rose met his eyes. "Because before you sign those papers, you should know what you're erasing. You think this is just dirt? This is 4 generations of people who refused to quit, who chose this place over easier lives, who died and were buried here because they believed in something bigger than themselves. That's not fair." "No, it's not. But it's true." Richard's jaw tightened. "You're trying to guilt me into staying. I'm trying to make sure you understand what staying would mean and what leaving would cost." Rose started gathering the photos. "But it's still your choice. It was always your choice." At noon, they drove to Richland in Rose's truck, neither of them talking much. The town was exactly how Richard remembered. One main street, a few shops, more churches than bars, and everybody knowing everybody's business. They passed the feed store where Rose's mother had worked, the diner where his father used to eat breakfast every Saturday, the courthouse where 4 generations of Hales had paid their property taxes. Preston Kimball's office was above the bank, accessible by stairs that creaked like they were older than the building itself. The lawyer was waiting in his reception area, all expensive suit and practiced smile. "Mr. Hale, good to see you," and he looked at Rose with barely concealed disapproval. "Miss Delgado, I wasn't aware you'd be joining us." "She's here because I asked her to be," Richard said. "I see. Well, shall we?" Kimball gestured to his office. They sat in leather chairs across from Kimball's massive desk while he arranged paperwork like he was dealing cards. "I have excellent news. The developer increased their offer to $1.6 million. Cash sale, close in 30 days. All you need to do is sign." He slid a document across the desk. Richard stared at it without picking it up. "There's also interest from a private buyer," Kimball continued. "Wants to keep it as ranch land, but their offer is considerably lower. $800,000. "Who's the buyer?" Rose asked. Kimball glanced at her like he'd forgotten she could speak. "A consortium of local ranchers. They'd split the property, maintain it agriculturally. But as I said, the price point is significantly—" "I want to see that offer," Richard said. Kimball's smile tightened. "Mr. Hale, with all due respect, you'd be leaving $800,000 on the table. That's not a sound financial decision." "I didn't ask for financial advice. I asked to see the offer." Kimball produced another document, slid it across with considerably less enthusiasm. Richard scanned it. 800,000, split between Tom Hollis and 3 other ranchers he vaguely recognized. They'd divide the land into 4 parcels, keep the cattle operation going, maintain the house as a historical property. "They can't afford 1.6? Richard asked. "They're ranchers, not real estate speculators. 800 is likely every dollar they can scrape together." Richard set the paper down. "And the developer? What's their plan?" "Residential subdivision, 200 homes on half-acre lots. They'd preserve 10 acres around the main house as a park, community feature. Very tasteful development, really." 200 houses, Rose said quietly, "on land that's been ranch for 130 years. Kimball shot her a look. "Progress, Miss Delgado. The county needs housing, needs tax revenue. Ranching is a dying industry. Better to accept that and move forward. Nothing's dying that we don't let die, Rose said. That's a lovely sentiment, but economically naive. The numbers don't lie. Ranch land across Texas is being converted to residential use at unprecedented rates. It's simple market forces. Richard picked up this pen Kimball had positioned next to the developer's contract. He held it, feeling the weight, and thought about his great-grandfather standing in front of an unfinished house, betting everything on land people said was worthless. "Give me a minute," Richard said. "Of course. Take your time." Richard stood, walked to the window overlooking Main Street. Rose joined him. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. "That I don't know who I am if I'm not the guy who left, the guy who got out, the guy who built a life somewhere else." "You're still that guy. Staying doesn't erase Dallas, doesn't erase anything you've built." "Jennifer will leave me." "Probably." "My boss will fire me." "Definitely." Richard laughed, short, bitter. "And I'll be stuck on a failing ranch in the middle of nowhere with a woman who barely tolerates me and a dog who thinks I'm an idiot." "Shadow's warming up to you." "That's not the point." Rose turned to face him. "Then what is the point?" "The point is, I don't know how to do this. Don't know how to run a ranch. Don't know how to make it profitable. Don't even know if I want to. I just know that signing that paper feels like killing something, something that deserves better." "Then don't sign it. And do what instead?" "Figure it out, same as everybody else." Kimball cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, the developer is on a timeline. They need an answer today." Richard walked back to the desk, still holding the pen. He looked at the contract, at the number with all those zeros, at the signature line waiting for his name. Then he set the pen down. "I need to make a call." He stepped into the hallway, dialed Jennifer. She answered immediately. "Finally, where have you been?" "At the lawyer's office." "Good. So it's done? You signed?" "Not yet." "Jen, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." Silence. Then, "Okay. I'm thinking about keeping the ranch." "What? Richard, that's insane. We talked about this. You hate that place." "I thought I did. But being here, learning about it, understanding what it meant to my father—" "Your father abandoned you. Why do you care what it meant to him?" "Because he's dead, and I'm not. Because I have a chance to understand something he spent his whole life building. Because walking away feels like I'm abandoning him the same way I think he abandoned me." Jennifer's voice went cold. "So you're choosing a dead man over me?" "I'm choosing to figure out who I am, and I think I need to do that here." "For how long?" "I don't know." "That's not an answer, Richard. It's the only one I have." He heard her breathing on the other end, heard her fighting to stay calm. "If you do this, we're done. I'm not going to sit in Dallas waiting for you to have some kind of midlife crisis on a ranch in the middle of nowhere." "I know." "You're really choosing this over us? Over the life we could build together?" Richard closed his eyes. "I'm not choosing against you. I'm just choosing for something I didn't know I needed until I got here. That's the same thing, and you know it." A pause. "I hope it's worth it." She hung up. Richard stood in the hallway holding a dead phone, feeling like he'd just set fire to his entire life. But underneath the panic and regret was something else, something that felt like relief. He went back into Kimball's office. Rose was sitting exactly where he'd left her, shadow at her feet. Kimball was checking his watch. "Mr. Hale, have you reached a decision?" Richard sat down. "I'm not selling." Kimball blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The ranch. I'm keeping it." The lawyer's face went through several expressions before settling on professional concern. "Mr. Hale, I strongly advise against making emotional decisions about property of this value. Perhaps take a few more days to—" "I don't need more days, I've decided." "You understand you're refusing $1.6 million? I can count." Kimball sat back, reassessing. "May I ask what changed your mind?" Richard looked at Rose. She was staring at him like she'd never seen him before. "I found some letters, some photos, some things I didn't know about my father, about this place, and I realized I spent 34 years running from something I never understood." "That's very poetic, but this is a business decision, not a therapy session." "Maybe it's both." Richard stood. "What do I need to do, legally, to keep the property?" Kimball sighed. Nothing. It's already yours, though you'll need to address the tax situation. 6 months in arrears, as I mentioned. And the ranch is hemorrhaging money. Without significant capital investment, it won't be viable long term. How much are we talking? Conservatively, $200,000 to get it operational. New equipment, fence repair, herd expansion. And that's not counting operating expenses, which run about $70,000 annually. Richard's stomach dropped. He had maybe $40,000 in savings. What if I sold part of the land, kept the house and 100 acres, sold the rest to the ranchers? Kimball considered this. Possible. Though the rancher's offer was for the complete parcel, they'd need to renegotiate, and you'd need at least 300 acres to run a viable cattle operation. Then we'll figure something else out, Rose finally spoke. Richard, you don't have to do this. Keeping it just to keep it isn't... I'm not keeping it just to keep it. He turned to her. Remember that will I found? The handwritten one, where my father left the ranch to both of us? That's not legal. It is if I make it legal. Richard looked at Kimball. Can I add someone to the deed? The lawyer's eyebrows rose. You can, though I'd need to know who and why. Rose Delgado. Equal ownership. 50-50 split. The room went silent. Rose stood up. No. Yes. Richard, you can't just... I can and I am. You spent 6 years keeping this place alive. You earned it more than I ever did. But it's your inheritance, your family legacy, and your family. My father said so in that will. He called you his daughter. He wanted you to have this. So I'm making it happen. Rose's eyes were wet. You're being stupid. Probably, but I'm doing it anyway. Richard turned to Kimball. Draw up whatever papers you need. Equal ownership, equal liability, equal decision-making. We run it together or we don't run it at all. Kimball looked between them. This is highly irregular. I don't care. Can you do it or not? I can do it, but Miss Delgado would need to agree. And both of you should understand, joint ownership means joint responsibility. If the ranch fails, you both go down with it. I understand, Richard said. They both looked at Rose. She was staring at Richard like he'd grown a second head. This is crazy. Yeah. We don't even know if we can work together. We'll figure it out. You live in Dallas. You have a job, a life. Had a job, had a life. Past tense as of about 10 minutes ago. Rose sank back into her chair. Shadow put his head on her knee and she absently scratched his ears. Why are you doing this? Richard sat down next to her. Because my father couldn't. Because he spent his whole life trying to do the right thing but being too scared to actually do it. Because I spent 34 years being angry at him for being a coward. And I just realized I'm exactly the same. And because he stopped, swallowed. Because you're right. Some things are worth more than money, and I think this place might be one of them. Rose didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, if we do this, we do it right. No half measures. No giving up when it gets hard. Agreed. And you pull your weight. I'm not doing all the work while you play cowboy. I'll pull my weight. And we make decisions together. Equal say. No, I'm the Hale so I know best bullshit. Richard held out his hand. Equal partners. Rose looked at his hand, then at his face, searching for something. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she took his hand and shook it. Equal partners. Kimball cleared his throat. I'll draw up the paperwork. It'll take a few days. In the meantime, I'll notify the developer that you're declining their offer. And the ranchers? I'll let them know as well. They'll be disappointed, but not surprised. Tom Hollis called yesterday asking if there was any chance you'd reconsider. Richard smiled. Tell Tom we're keeping it, and tell him if he wants to help us figure out how to make this place profitable. I'm buying the first round at the diner. After they left Kimball's office, Rose drove them back to the ranch in silence. Richard kept waiting for her to say something, to tell him he was being stupid or noble or crazy, but she just drove, one hand on the wheel, wind whipping through the open windows. Finally, Richard said, You're quiet. Thinking. About? About how we're going to pull this off. $200,000 to get operational. We don't have that kind of money. I have $40,000 in savings, and we could sell some of the equipment my father wasn't using. That old tractor in the barn, maybe some of the unused tools. That might get us another $10,000, $15,000. We're still short. Then we get a loan. Rose snorted. Banks don't loan money to failing ranches run by people who don't know what they're doing. One of us knows what she's doing. One isn't enough. You need to learn fast, Richard. I mean, really learn. Not just feeding chickens. You need to know breeding cycles and market prices and drought management, and then teach me. She glanced at him. It's not something you learn in a few weeks. I'm not planning to learn it in a few weeks. I'm planning to learn it over years, however long it takes. Rose pulled the truck over to the side of the road, put it in park. She turned to face him. I need to know you're serious. Not just about the ranch, but about this. About staying. Because I can't go through watching someone else give up on this place. I can't lose it again. I'm serious. You say that now, but when winter comes and the pipes freeze and you're up at 4 a.m. trying to keep cattle alive in a norther, when summer comes and it's 110 degrees and nothing's growing and you're hemorrhaging money, you gonna be serious then? Richard met her eyes. I don't know, I've never done this. I don't know if I'll be good at it or even if I'll like it, but I know running back to Dallas and pretending this place doesn't exist will make me a coward. And I'm tired of being a coward. Rose studied him for a long time. Then she put the truck back in gear and pulled back onto the road. Okay, but first thing tomorrow we're fixing the south fence. It's a mess and it won't hold through summer. And you're doing the work, not watching. Deal. When they got back to the ranch, Richard's phone rang. His boss. He almost didn't answer, then decided ripping off the Band-Aid was better than dragging it out. Richard, finally! Where the hell have you been? Texas, family emergency. For a week? We've got the Morrison account breathing down our necks, and you're the only one who knows the specifications. When are you coming back? Richard took a breath. I'm not. Silence. Then, what do you mean you're not? I'm staying here, in Texas. I'm sorry, Jim. I know the timing is terrible, but I can't come back. Can't or won't? Both. Jesus, Richard. This is professional suicide. You know that, right? You walk out on Morrison and you're done in this industry. I know. Is this about money? Because we can talk about a raise, renegotiate your... It's not about money. I just need to be here. Need to do this. His boss sighed. I'll need your resignation in writing by Friday. You'll have it. The call ended. Richard stood in the driveway of Richland Ranch, unemployed, newly single, joint owner of a failing ranch in the middle of nowhere, and felt more alive than he had in 20 years. Rose was in the barn checking on the cattle. Richard found her examining a cow's leg, talking to it in the low, calm voice she used with animals. She's limping, Rose said without looking up. Probably stepped on something. Need to check for infection. Richard knelt down next to her. Show me how. Rose glanced at him, surprised. Then she handed him the cow's leg. Feel right here. You're looking for heat, swelling, any sign of abscess. Richard ran his hands over the cow's leg like she showed him, feeling for problems he didn't know how to recognize yet. But he'd learn. That's what tomorrow was for, and the day after, and all the days after that. That night they sat on the back porch watching the sunset, shadow between them, and Rose said, Your girlfriend's really gone? Yeah? Sorry. I'm not. Not really. She wanted someone I'm not sure I ever was. What did she want? Someone stable, predictable, someone who knew what he wanted and went after it without doubt or hesitation. Rose laughed. That's not you. No, that's definitely not me. They drank beer as the sky went purple, then black, and the stars came out thick as paint. The ranch was quiet except for the wind and the cattle and the old house breathing behind them. We should throw a party, Richard said suddenly. A party? Yeah, invite the whole town. Announce that we're keeping the ranch, that we're partners, that Richland isn't going anywhere. Make it official. Rose considered this. People will talk. Already are talking, probably. Two people living alone on a ranch, not married, not related. Let them talk. We know the truth. Which is? That we're family. Not by blood, but by choice. And that's what matters. Rose smiled. The first real smile Richard had seen from her. Okay, a party. Saturday. We'll cook out, invite everybody, show them this place is still alive. I don't know how to cook for a crowd. Good thing I do. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Richard worked harder than he had in his entire life, repairing fence from dawn to dusk while Rose managed the ranch operations and planned the party. His hands blistered, his back screamed, and every night he fell into bed too exhausted to dream. But he was happy. Friday afternoon, Tom Hollis showed up with his truck full of fence posts. "Heard you might need these." "How much?" Richard asked. "Nothing. Consider it a welcome home present." Tom climbed out of the truck. "Heard you're keeping the place. That true?" "Yeah." "Heard you made Rose a partner." "Yeah." Tom looked at him for a long moment, then held out his hand. "Your father would be proud." Richard shook it. "I hope so." "He would be. Trust me. Now let's get these posts unloaded before the sun cooks us." Saturday morning dawned clear and hot. By noon, the ranch was transformed. Rose had set up tables under the oak trees. Tom and his sons had brought a smoker, and people started arriving around 1. Ranchers and feed store workers, and people from town Richard vaguely remembered. Mrs. Chen from the library. The couple who ran the diner. Even Preston Kimball showed up, looking uncomfortable in jeans. Richard stood on the porch watching them all gather and felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Pride, maybe. Or belonging. Or just the simple satisfaction of seeing something broken become whole. Rose appeared beside him, wearing a clean shirt and her hair down for once. "You ready?" "For what?" "To tell them why we're all here, like..." Richard looked at the crowd of maybe 60 people, eating and talking and laughing on land his family had owned for 4 generations. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say much. Just tell them the truth." They walked out to where everyone was gathered. Tom whistled, and the crowd quieted. Richard cleared his throat. "I'm not good at speeches. Never was. But I wanted to thank you all for coming. For the last week I've been trying to figure out what this place means. What it meant to my father. What it means to Rose. What it could mean to me. And I think I finally understand. It's not about the land or the money or even the legacy. It's about community. About people choosing to show up for each other even when it's hard. Even when it would be easier to quit. So Rose and I have decided to keep Richland Ranch. To rebuild it. To make it something the community can be proud of again. He paused, looked at Rose. She nodded. "And we're doing it together. As equal partners. As family." The crowd was silent for a moment. Then Tom started clapping and everyone joined in. People came up to shake Richard's hand, to hug Rose, to welcome them both into something Richard was only beginning to understand. Late that night, after everyone had left and the cleanup was done, Richard and Rose sat on the porch one more time. "We did it," Rose said. "We announced we're keeping it. Now we have to actually keep it. Scared?" "Terrified." "Good. Means you're taking it seriously." Rose stood up, stretched. "I'm going to bed. Tomorrow we start on the barn roof. It's been leaking for 2 years and I'm tired of putting buckets under it. I've never fixed a roof." "Then tomorrow you learn." She went inside, shadow trailing after her. Richard stayed on the porch, looking out at the land that was now half his, and thought about his father sitting in this same spot, drinking the same beer, watching the same stars. "I hope I don't screw this up," Richard said to the night, to his father's ghost, to whoever was listening. The wind picked up, moving through the grass like a whispered answer. The barn roof nearly killed Richard in his second week as a rancher. He was up on the slope wrestling with a sheet of corrugated metal when his foot slipped, and for one heart-stopping moment, he was sliding toward the edge with nothing to grab onto. Rose caught him by the belt, hauled him back, and then stood there shaking with fury or fear or both. "You trying to die up here?" she yelled. "I was trying to nail down the corner like you showed me. I showed you how to do it without falling off the damn roof." She sat down hard on the tin, breathing like she'd run a mile. "Maybe we should hire this out." "We can't afford to hire it out. You said we had maybe 10,000 left after buying feed for winter." 10,000 won't mean much if you're dead." Richard sat next to her, both of them perched on the barn roof in the blazing sun, and started laughing. Rose looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "What's funny? 2 weeks ago, I was in an air-conditioned office sending emails about marketing strategy. Now I'm almost dying on a barn roof and arguing with a woman who pulls me back from the edge by my belt. My life is completely insane." Rose's mouth twitched. Then she was laughing too, and they sat there like idiots cackling on top of a barn while Shadow barked at them from below, probably convinced they'd both lost it. "Come on," Rose said finally, wiping her eyes. Let's finish this before we both end up in the hospital. They worked until sunset, and when they climbed down, Richard's hands were bleeding through his gloves and every muscle screamed. But the roof was fixed. Actually fixed, not just patched with prayers and hope. That night Rose made dinner, chicken and rice and vegetables from the garden, and they ate at the kitchen table like they'd been doing it for years instead of weeks. Tom stopped by while you were in town getting supplies, Rose said. He wants to know if we're interested in going in on a cattle buy with him and the Hendersons. Bulk rate, better quality stock than we could get alone. How much? $30,000 for our share. Richard nearly choked on his rice. We don't have $30,000. I know. But Tom says the bank might loan it if we can show them a solid business plan. Show we're serious about rebuilding. And are we? Serious? Rose looked at him across the table. I am. Question is whether you are. Richard thought about his blistered hands, his aching back, the fact that he'd almost died on a barn roof. Thought about Jennifer's final text message, hope you're happy, and his empty apartment in Dallas that he'd given notice on last week. Thought about how the ranch was bleeding money faster than they could patch the holes, how they were one bad season away from losing everything. Yeah, he said, I'm serious. Then I'll tell Tom we're in. The business plan took them 3 weeks to write. Rose handled the operational side, breeding schedules, pasture rotation, market projections. Richard, drawing on skills he'd forgotten he had, built the financial models and projections. They worked late into the night, the kitchen table covered in papers, arguing over every number. We can't promise a 20% return in year 1, Rose insisted. That's not realistic with cattle prices where they are. The bank won't loan us money for 5% returns. We need to show growth potential. Growth potential based on fantasy numbers won't help us when we can't deliver. So what do you suggest? Rose tapped the spreadsheet. We diversify. Don't put everything in cattle. We've got land nobody's using. We could lease some of it for hunting. Seasonal income, low overhead. You want to turn the ranch into a hunting preserve? I want to turn the ranch into something that survives. Your great-grandfather adapted when he had to. Your grandfather adapted. Now it's our turn. Richard looked at her, really looked. Somewhere in the last month, she'd stopped being the hostile stranger who'd answered his father's door and become his partner, his friend, the person who pulled him back from literal edges and metaphorical ones. Okay, he said, hunting leases. What else? They presented their business plan to the bank on a Tuesday morning in October. The loan officer was a woman named Patricia Reeves who'd gone to school with Richard's mother and didn't bother hiding her skepticism. You understand the failure rate for ranch operations in this county is over 60%, she said, flipping through their proposal. We understand, Richard said, and neither of you has significant ranching experience. Miss Delgado, you've been working the Hale property for 6 years, but you've never run an operation independently. And Mr. Hale, your background is in marketing, not exactly applicable skills. I'm learning, Richard said. Learning isn't the same as knowing. Patricia set down the proposal. I'll be honest. This is a high-risk loan. Your projections are optimistic. Your collateral is a property that's been declining in value, and you're asking for $30,000 you might not be able to pay back. But, Rose prompted. Patricia smiled slightly. But this community needs working ranches, needs families willing to fight for this land instead of selling it to developers. And your father, she looked at Richard. Victor was a stubborn son of a bitch who kept this place alive through sheer force of will. Maybe that runs in the family. She approved the loan. Walking out of the bank, Richard felt like he could breathe for the first time in weeks. Rose drove them to the diner and ordered breakfast, even though it was noon, and they sat in a corner booth drinking too much coffee and planning the next 6 months. First thing is fencing, Rose said. We've got maybe 10 miles that need replacing. Can't graze cattle properly without solid fence. Tom said his sons could help. Weekend work. I'll pay them in labor exchange. Good. Second thing is the windmills. 3 of the 7 are barely functioning. We need parts. How much? About $5,000 if we buy used, $8,000 if we go new. Richard winced. Used it is. Third thing, Rose paused. We need to talk about the house. What about it? It's falling apart, Richard. Plumbing's shot, electrical is dangerous, foundation's cracking. We fix the ranch but let the house die, it won't matter. This place needs a center, needs somewhere people can see is worth saving. How much to fix it? More than we have. They sat in silence, picking at eggs. Neither of them was hungry for any more. We could do it ourselves, Richard said finally. The work, I mean, weekends, evenings. Learn as we go like we've been doing with everything else. That'll take years. Then it takes years. Rose met his eyes. You planning to be here for years? Are you? I asked first. Richard set down his fork. I sold my condo, quit my job, burned every bridge back to my old life. So yeah, I'm planning to be here for years, unless you're planning to kick me out. Wouldn't dream of it. You're finally getting useful. The first winter was brutal. A norther blew in the week before Thanksgiving and stayed for 10 days, temperatures dropping to single digits, pipes freezing, cattle huddling in misery. Richard and Rose worked around the clock breaking ice in water troughs, hauling feed through snow that shouldn't have existed this far south, keeping newborn calves alive in the barn. On the worst night, wind howling, temperature at 6 degrees, Rose was in the barn with a calf that was dying despite everything they'd tried. Richard found her at 2 a.m, sitting in the hay with the calf's head in her lap, crying. It's not going to make it, she said. Richard sat down next to her. The calf was barely breathing, too cold, too weak. You did everything you could. It's not enough. Nothing's ever enough out here. You work yourself to death, and the land just keeps taking. Then we give it something worth taking. Rose looked at him, face wet with tears and exhaustion. I don't know if I can keep doing this, losing things, watching everything I work for slip away. You're not doing it alone anymore. That doesn't make it easier. No, Richard agreed, but it makes it possible. The calf died an hour later. They buried it in the morning, and Rose didn't say a word for the rest of the day. But she kept working, kept fighting, kept showing up. That's what Richard learned that first year, that ranch work wasn't about winning. It was about showing up every day and doing what needed doing even when it broke your heart. Even when the math didn't work and the weather didn't cooperate and every rational part of your brain was screaming to quit. Spring brought new problems. A fence break that let half their herd wander onto the highway. A tractor that died and needed parts they couldn't afford. A drought that started early and showed no signs of stopping. Richard learned to fix things with wire and hope, to stretch dollars until they screamed, to function on 4 hours of sleep and pure stubbornness. He also learned that he was happy. Not happy in the way he'd been in Dallas, comfortable, predictable, safe. Happy in a way that came from working until his body gave out, from solving problems that mattered, from building something with his hands that would outlast him. You're smiling, Rose said one evening as they fixed fence in the golden hour before sunset. Am I? Yeah, you do that now. Smile for no reason. Maybe I have a reason. Which is, Richard hammered in a staple, tested the wire. This, all of this. Knowing that when I wake up tomorrow there's work that matters, problems I can actually solve, land that needs me. The land doesn't need you. It was here before you and it'll be here after. Then maybe I need it. Rose handed him another staple. Yeah, maybe you do. Summer of the second year brought their first real success. The hunting leases Rose had proposed started paying off. Groups from Houston and Dallas willing to pay good money to shoot deer and wild pigs on authentic ranch land. It wasn't cattle sale money, but it was steady, predictable income that let them buy the things they needed without panic. They also started hosting events. Small weddings, corporate retreats, photo shoots. Rose handled the logistics while Richard managed the books and marketing. It felt strange using his old skills in this new context, but it worked. People wanted authenticity, wanted to experience ranch life without actually having to live it. We're becoming a tourist attraction, Rose said, watching a wedding party take photos by the barn. We're becoming solvent. I'll take it. By fall of year 2, they'd paid down a third of the loan and actually had money in savings. Not much, maybe $8,000, but more than zero. More than Richard had ever imagined when he'd first driven up that driveway planning to sell. The town had changed toward them too. At first, people had been skeptical, waiting for the city boy to give up and run back to Dallas. But Richard kept showing up at the feed store, kept working beside Tom and the other ranchers, kept proving he wasn't going anywhere. Eventually, the skepticism turned to acceptance, then to respect. Tom wants to know if we'll host the County Cattlemen's Association meeting in October, Rose said one morning over coffee. Here? Says Richland Ranch used to host it every year when your grandfather was alive. Thinks it's time to bring that tradition back. Richard thought about his grandfather Samuel, who'd kept this place alive through the Dust Bowl through sheer determination. Thought about hosting 70 ranchers in the house he and Rose had spent 2 years slowly repairing. Tell Tom yes. The meeting was chaos. 70 ranchers crammed into the house and barn, arguing about grazing rights and water policy, and the future of ranching in a state that seemed determined to pave over everything. But afterward, Tom pulled Richard aside. You did good, he said. Your grandfather would be proud. Your father, too. You think? I know. Victor talked about you all the time. Wondered what you were doing, if you were happy. He'd be glad you're here. Glad you figured out what he couldn't tell you. Which was? That this place isn't a prison, it's a choice, and choosing it means something. Year 3 brought Rose's mother's sister, an Aunt Richard didn't know existed, to the ranch. Elena Delgado showed up on a Sunday morning with a car full of belongings and nowhere else to go. Her husband had died, her kids were grown and gone, and she'd heard Rose was running the old Hale place. I can work, Elena said, standing in the driveway looking uncertain. I can cook, clean, help with whatever you need. I just need a place to land for a while. Rose looked at Richard. He shrugged. We've got room. Elena moved into the spare bedroom and within a week had transformed the place. She cooked real meals, not just the quick ranch food Rose threw together, but elaborate dinners that filled the house with smells Richard had forgotten existed. She kept the garden that Rose never had time for, grew vegetables they actually ate instead of buying at the store. She became the thing neither Richard nor Rose knew they needed. Family. One night, the three of them sat on the porch after dinner, Elena darning socks while Richard and Rose went over the books. You two remind me of Maria and Victor, Elena said suddenly. Richard looked up. What do you mean? The way they worked together. Different people with different skills, but moving toward the same goal. They loved each other, you know, even though they couldn't be together the way they wanted. They chose to love each other anyway. Rose and I aren't, Richard started. I know, but your family, that's its own kind of love. After Elena went to bed, Rose said, You ever think about getting married? Having kids? Used to. When I was with Jennifer, I thought about it as this thing I should want, this next logical step, but it never felt right. And now? Now I think there are different ways to build a family, different ways to leave something behind. Richard gestured at the ranch. This feels like enough. Like more than enough. Rose was quiet for a moment, then, Victor used to say the ranch was his legacy, but I think he was wrong. The ranch is just land. What matters is what you do with it, who you share it with. You think we're doing okay, sharing it? Better than okay? We're doing what he couldn't. We're making it work. Year 5 brought the drought. The real one, not the little dry spells they'd managed before. Rain stopped in April and didn't come back for 8 months. The grass turned brown, then gray, then to dust. Water levels in the stock tanks dropped day by day. Richard and Rose watched their carefully built success start to crumble. We need to sell half the herd, Rose said, staring at the dried-up pasture. Can't feed them all through this. Sale prices are going to be terrible. Everyone's selling. Then we take terrible prices or watch them starve. Your choice. They sold 40 head at a loss, used the money to buy feed, and keep the rest alive. It hurt watching the cattle go, watching years of careful breeding and selection disappear. But the alternative was worse. The drought broke in December with a storm that was almost violent, 3 inches in 6 hours, flooding the creek, turning the ranch into a muddy mess. Richard stood in the rain with his arms spread, laughing like a maniac while Rose watched from the porch, shaking her head. You're going to catch pneumonia, she called. I don't care, it's raining. That winter, they rebuilt. Slowly. Carefully. They'd learned their lesson about moving too fast, about assuming good years would last. They saved more, spent less, planned for disasters they hoped wouldn't come. Year 7 brought the article. A writer from a Dallas magazine came to do a story on small ranches surviving against the odds, and somehow Richland ended up as the centerpiece. The article talked about Richard's return, about Rose's dedication, about two people rebuilding a dying ranch through stubbornness and partnership. The day it published, Richard's phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. "Richard, it's Jennifer." He almost dropped the phone. "Jennifer, hi." "I read the article. You and Rose, you're really doing it, making it work." "Trying to?" "I'm happy for you, really. I know I didn't understand when you left. But reading about what you've built, what you're doing out there, I get it now. Thanks. Are you happy?" Richard looked out the kitchen window at Rose working with a new calf, Elena in the garden, Shadow sprawled in the shade. "Yeah, I really am." "Good. You deserve that." After she hung up, Rose came in for water. "Who was that?" "Old friend, just checking in." "Must have been some friend. You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have. Maybe that's what the past is, ghosts we carry around until we figure out how to let them go." By year 10, Richland Ranch was profitable. Not rich, they'd never be rich, but stable, sustainable. They'd paid off the loan, expanded the herd to 70 head, added goats for brush control and extra income, and built their event business into something reliable. The house was fully restored, the barn was solid, and every fence on the property was tight and true. Richard was 53 and looked 60, sun-weathered, permanently scarred from barbed wire and hard work, gray in his hair and beard. Rose was 40 and looked ageless, still strong, still stubborn, still the backbone of everything they did. Elena was 67 and kept threatening to retire but never did. Shadow had died in year 8 and been replaced by a new dog, also named Shadow, who was just as judgmental as the original. They sat on the porch one evening, the three of them plus Tom Hollis, who'd become more family than neighbor, drinking beer and watching the sunset paint the sky impossible colors. "You two ever think about what happens next?" Tom asked. "When you can't do this anymore?" "We're training the next generation," Rose said. "Got 3 kids from town who come work weekends, teaching them the same way Victor taught me." "Passing it on," Tom said. "That's good. That's how it should work." Richard thought about his great-grandfather James, his grandfather Samuel, his father Victor. Thought about all the ways they'd fought to keep this place alive, all the mistakes they'd made along the way. "You know what I learned?" Richard said. "The ranch doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. We're just caretakers for a while, and then someone else takes over. The land is the constant. We're just passing through." "That's surprisingly philosophical for a marketing guy from Dallas," Rose said. "Former marketing guy. I'm a rancher now." "Are you, though? Because I still do most of the actual work. I feed the chickens. You feed them wrong, and they hate you." Elena laughed. "You two sound like an old married couple." "We're not married," Richard and Rose said in unison, then looked at each other and laughed. "No," Rose said, "but we're partners. Family. That's better than married." Richard had to agree. What he and Rose had built wasn't romance. It was something deeper. It was trust earned through shared hardship, respect built through years of working toward the same goal, love that came from choosing to show up for each other every single day, even when it was hard. The article writer had asked Richard if he regretted leaving Dallas, if he ever wondered what his life would have been like if he'd sold the ranch and taken the money. He'd answered honestly, "Every choice costs something. I gave up comfort, security, a career I was good at. But I gained something I didn't know I needed, purpose, connection, a reason to wake up that matters more than a paycheck. Would I do it again?" Without hesitation. Year 15 brought Richard's 60th birthday. Rose and Elena threw him a party. Not a big affair, just the people who mattered. Tom and his family. The kids from town they'd been training. Patricia Reeves from the bank, who'd taken a chance on 2 people with more heart than sense. Preston Kimball, who'd become an unlikely friend. They sat under the oak tree, the same tree Richard's great-grandfather had planted the year the house was built, and ate barbecue and told stories. Tom talked about the time Richard had almost burned down the barn trying to weld. Elena talked about her sister Maria and how she would have loved seeing the ranch alive again. Rose told the story of catching Richard by his belt when he slipped off the barn roof, and everybody laughed. Later, when most people had gone home, Richard stood looking at the house. It glowed in the evening light, smoke rising from the chimney, every window warm. It looked alive. It looked loved. Rose came to stand beside him. "What are you thinking?" "That I almost missed this." almost sold it and walked away. But you didn't. Only because you were here, because you showed me what it could be. Rose shook her head. I showed you what it was. You're the one who chose to see it. They stood in comfortable silence while the sun set and the stars came out. Shadow, the third one now, though Richard had lost count, wandered over and flopped down at their feet. You think my father knew? Richard asked. That this is how it would turn out? I think he hoped. I think that's why he wrote those letters, why he kept your room the same, why he asked me to take care of the place until you came back. He was giving you a choice. Same choice he had, same choice we all have, to stay or to leave. I'm glad I stayed. Me too. Year 20 brought Elena's death, peaceful, in her sleep, after an evening spent cooking and laughing and being exactly who she'd always been. They buried her next to Maria in the small cemetery on the eastern edge of the property, where Hales had been buried for generations. Rose took it hard. Lost the aunt who'd been more mother to her than her actual mother had ever been. Richard found her crying in the barn one morning, trying to hide it behind work. She wouldn't want you crying, Richard said. I know, but I can't help it. She was the last connection to my mother, the last person who knew what our family was before everything fell apart. No, she wasn't. You are. Rose looked at him with red eyes. I'm nobody, just a girl who got lucky that Victor took pity on her. You're Rose Delgado, co-owner of Richland Ranch, the woman who saved this place when everyone else had given up. The person who taught me that home isn't where you're born. It's where you choose to stay. I said that? Year 1, when I was still trying to figure out what the hell I was doing here. Rose wiped her eyes. Year 1. Feels like a lifetime ago. It was. We were different people. You think we're better now? Richard considered this. I think we're real now. The people we were supposed to become if we weren't busy being who everyone else expected. They stood in the barn, the same barn Richard's great-grandfather had built, that his grandfather had expanded, that his father had maintained, that Richard and Rose had saved, and Richard thought about all the generations of people who'd passed through this place, all the lives lived, the choices made, the legacy built one day at a time. Year 25 brought Richard to 70. Rose was 65 and still worked like she was 30, though she'd finally let the kids they'd trained take over most of the heavy lifting. The ranch was thriving, not in spite of the changing world, but because they'd learned to change with it. Solar panels on the barn roof, water conservation systems, rotational grazing that kept the land healthy, partnerships with other small ranches that let them compete with the big operations. They'd become what Richard's father had hoped for, a model for how a small ranch could survive in the modern world. People came from all over to learn from them, to see how they'd made it work, to understand how two stubborn people had rebuilt a dying ranch into something viable. But the real success wasn't the money or the recognition. It was the land itself. The grass was healthier than it had been in 50 years. The creek ran clearer. Wildlife had returned, deer and turkeys, and even the occasional antelope. The ranch had healed, and in healing, it had healed Richard and Rose too. One evening, they sat under the oak tree, their spot now, the place they always came to think, and watched the sun set over land they'd spent 2.5 decades learning to love. I found something yesterday, Rose said, cleaning out the attic. What? She handed him a photograph. It showed Victor and Richard, maybe a year before everything fell apart. They were working on a fence together, both dirty and tired and smiling. Richard looked maybe 8 years old. I don't remember this. Your father kept it in his desk, must have fallen behind a drawer and been forgotten. Richard studied the photo, studied the way his father's hand rested on his shoulder, the way they were both looking at each other instead of the camera. I spent so many years angry at him. You had a right to be. Did I, though? He was just a man trying his best, making mistakes, trying to love me the only way he knew how. You think you've forgiven him? Richard thought about this. 34 years of silence, 25 years of understanding. I think I've done something better. I've understood him, and maybe that's what forgiveness is. Not saying someone was right, but understanding why they did what they did. Rose nodded. He loved you in his own way. He just didn't know how to show it. Same way I loved him. Took me half a lifetime to figure out that love doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real. They sat until the stars came out, Two old people who'd built something impossible through sheer stubbornness, and Richard realized this was what his great-grandfather had felt, what his grandfather had known, what his father had tried to tell him in all those unsent letters. The ranch wasn't just land. It was proof that some things were worth fighting for, worth suffering for, worth staying for. Year 30 brought the decision neither of them wanted to make. Rose's knees were shot from decades of hard work. Richard's heart was giving him trouble. They could still run the ranch, barely, but they both knew their time was running out. "We need to talk about succession," Richard said one morning. "I know. The kids we've been training, they're ready." "You sure?" Richard thought about Miguel and Hannah and James, 3 kids from town who'd grown into adults working weekends and summers at Richland, who'd learned the way Richard and Rose had learned, through mistakes and hard work and refusing to quit. "Yeah, I'm sure. Question is whether they want it." They asked that weekend, sat the 3 of them down in the kitchen and laid out the situation. The ranch needed new leadership. Richard and Rose could stay on as consultants, advisors, but the day-to-day had to go to someone with younger backs and stronger knees. "We can't pay you what you're worth," Rose said bluntly. "This isn't about getting rich. This is about keeping something alive that's bigger than any of us." Miguel spoke first. "My grandfather worked at the feed store with your mother," he said to Rose. "He used to talk about Richland Ranch like it was sacred, like it mattered more than just cattle and land." "My mom grew up here," Hannah added. "She remembers playing in the creek, riding horses in the pasture before her family moved to Houston. She said this place taught her what home meant." James just nodded. "We want it, all 3 of us. We've been talking about how to keep the ranch going once you 2 couldn't anymore. We want to buy in, become partners, keep it alive for the next generation." Richard and Rose looked at each other. Then Richard said, "You don't buy in. We gift it to you, equal shares, same as Rose and I have now." "That's not fair to you," Miguel protested. "Sure it is. We got 30 years out of this place. 30 years of learning what matters, of building something worth keeping. Now it's your turn." They transitioned slowly over the next 2 years. Miguel, Hannah, and James moved into the main house, while Richard and Rose moved into a smaller place they built on the property. Not a retirement. They still helped, still advised, still showed up when needed, but a passing of the torch. On their last night in the main house, Richard stood in his old bedroom, the room his father had kept unchanged for 34 years, the room Richard had finally moved into and made his own. He looked at the window that faced the east pasture, the same view he'd had as a child, and felt the weight of everything that had happened in this room, every choice made, every path taken, every moment that led to now. Rose appeared in the doorway. "You ready?" "Yeah. You?" "Not really, but I guess that's how it goes. You spend your whole life building something, and then you have to let it go." "We're not letting it go. We're letting it grow." They walked out together, Shadow the Fourth trailing behind them, and didn't look back. The new house was smaller but comfortable, and from the porch they could see the main house, see the lights in the windows, see Miguel and Hannah and James moving around inside, making it their own. "You think they'll make it?" Rose asked. "I think they'll try. That's all anyone can do." Year 34 brought Richard to 79 and Rose to 74. They spent their days in the small house, helping when needed, but mostly watching. Watching Miguel expand the herd using techniques Richard and Rose had spent decades perfecting. Watching Hannah turn the event business into something bigger than they'd imagined. Watching James manage the land with care and attention that would have made Victor proud. The ranch was thriving, better than thriving. It had become what Richard's great-grandfather had dreamed. A place that sustained not just itself, but the community around it. A model for how land and people could work together instead of against each other. One morning, Rose didn't get out of bed. Richard found her still, peaceful, gone in her sleep the way Elena had gone. He sat with her for a long time, holding her hand, saying goodbye to the woman who'd saved him without knowing she was doing it. The woman who'd pulled him back from edges both literal and metaphorical. The woman who'd been his partner, his family, his reason for staying when every instinct told him to run. They buried her next to Elena and Maria in the cemetery where 4 generations of people who'd loved this land now rested. The whole town came. Every rancher, every kid they'd taught, every person whose life had been touched by the ranch. Miguel spoke at the service. Rose used to say home isn't where you're born, it's where you choose to stay. She chose this place. chose to stay when everyone else was leaving, chose to fight for something bigger than herself. And because she stayed, the rest of us learned what it means to have roots, what it means to belong somewhere. After everyone left, Richard sat under the oak tree alone. Shadow, the fourth, fifth, he'd lost count, lay at his feet. The sun was setting over the land Richard had spent 34 years learning to love, and he thought about his father's unsent letters, about Rose's scarred hands, about all the moments that led to this one. He'd come back to Richland planning to sell and leave, to take the money and forget this place existed. Instead, he'd found something he didn't know he was looking for: purpose, connection, a reason to wake up that mattered more than comfort or security or any of the things he'd thought he wanted. The ranch had saved him. Or maybe he'd saved it. Or maybe, and this felt most true, they'd saved each other. Richard sat under that oak tree as the stars came out, as the land breathed around him, as everything his ancestors had built continued on without him, and understood finally what his father had tried to tell him in all those letters he never sent. Home isn't a place you inherit, it's a place you choose to protect. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it chooses you back. Richard died in his sleep 3 months later, peacefully, in the small house with a view of the ranch he'd spent 3 decades rebuilding. They buried him next to Rose, and if you stood in just the right spot, you could see all of them, James and Samuel and Victor and Maria and Elena and Rose and Richard, lying together in land that had held them in life and would hold them forever. Miguel and Hannah and James kept the ranch going. They taught their own kids the way Richard and Rose had taught them. The land stayed healthy, the community stayed connected, and Richland Ranch became exactly what it was always meant to be, a place where people learned that some things are worth fighting for, worth suffering for, worth staying for. Not because they're perfect, but because they're real. And sometimes that's more than enough.